Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Global Decarbonization Accelerator. I'm David Goldwyn. I chair the Energy Advisory Group at the Atlantic Council. Thanks for joining us today. We're here to talk about voluntary carbon markets and particularly nature-based, well, I guess we're calling it nature-based carbon sequestration. It is certainly a hot topic these days. There's a tremendous amount of opportunity in this space, providing revenues for communities, conservation, carbon sinks, better health, and a way to mobilize significant amounts of capital, for this space. But there's also an enormous amount of controversy these days about the integrity of these carbon offsets, whether there's truly additionality, whether there's really value going to the communities or not, whether the power relationship is equal or not, and there are huge differences between the price for these offsets in compliance markets versus voluntary markets. So there's certainly a lot to talk about today. And we have a terrific panel who is deep into these issues to join us. So on my immediate left is Kelly Hamrick Malvar, Senior Policy Advisor for International Climate Policy at the Nature Conservancy. To her left, Jacqueline Musitwa, Senior Climate Finance Advisor, USAID. To her left, back there, is Stella Bureau, Vice President for Climate for Cocoa Networks. And on my far left is Pedro Barata, who's both Associate Vice President of EDF, but also co-chair of the expert panel for the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. So they've got the unenviable job of trying to come up with standards for making sure that, that there is integrity here. So let's jump right in. I think the first question I'm going to have is for you, Pedro. There are all these questions about integrity, and you all are working on standards. So basically, can you identify for the audience what's the issue in terms of the challenge right now, and in terms of the work that you're doing, what is the pathway providing some sort of standardization to give people confidence in these kinds of credits?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the invitation. It's not as simple as a single challenge. There are very different areas where we are challenged in terms of integrity in the voluntary carbon market. They have mostly been identified for many years, in a way. We've been around these questions for a long time. So just to name a few, obviously additionality. Is the action that is being financed by carbon credits contributing to real mitigation, as opposed to just, adding revenue onto something that would already have happened? Permanence. How durable is the sequestration, in particular for removal projects? How durable is the sequestration? The idea that you can offset or compensate an emission that you're emitting now with something that is potentially going to be released in terms of sequestration 10 years from now kind of makes, I wouldn't say a mockery of the accounting system, but it does make a bad argument when you're trying to sell it. And so on and so on. Environmental and social safeguards are one big issue right now in terms of integrity. We've all heard stories about violations of land rights, or sometimes, for instance, communities trading away, put it this way, their rights or their titles to carbon revenues without being rigorously informed exactly what carbon trading is, because it's not, even for the most common person, carbon trading is already a tough concept, let alone somebody whose livelihood is in farming or in forest dweller in the middle of the Amazon. So those are the challenges. We know them. They've been around for a while, and so has been this initiative brought up by a number of private stakeholders and funded mostly by, or actually to date 100% by philanthropy, which is really to try to address all of these different challenges that we find. What are we doing? So all of these carbon crediting programs have their own way of addressing these different challenges, and they're coming up short in different ways, and sometimes they're not actually coming up short. In other words, there is good practice out there in the carbon crediting world, but it's not uniform. So you may have a carbon crediting program that has really nailed it on additionality, and they're doing excellent on additionality, but they're really underperforming in the way that they're addressing permanence. So in comes the Integrity Council as an initiative that tries to learn from the current practice, bring together all of the stakeholders, and really try to establish a threshold. What is the good practice that we would expect any carbon credit to perform to. And on the basis of that expectation, we would then issue a tag, a label. We don't have a proper name for it. It's CCP eligible, but core carbon principle eligible, meaning that is a credit, if it is tagged, that meets all of the criteria that we find are, I would call, current best practice. The purpose is also not only recognize current best practice, but also engage with a variety of stakeholders to really change the ecosystem. So for instance, learning from remote sensing and digital monitoring, reporting, verification systems, how do we best embed these into the carbon crediting programs? Not so that we're all fancy and we're all digital, but because they can provide a better way of addressing some of the monitoring challenges, for instance, for nature-based solutions. But because some of these systems, for example, are too costly, or because they're not necessarily rewarded, that increase in quality is not necessarily rewarded, it takes a kind of industry-wide approach to say, let's try and implement this across the programs. So that's basically what we've done. To finalize, we've just announced our assessment framework, and we're starting to go through the issue of through the system of assessing the credits in a market. We hope to get out the first labels in the first, if not in the first quarter, definitely in the first half of 2024. And we're also starting in January our continuous improvement working programs, which is kind of this longer term view of what needs to be changed in the market, such as digital MRV, new approaches to permanence. How do we make more visible the benefits that are accruing, the co-benefits of carbon markets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So,
really helpful. Thanks for laying out the issue. Kelly, let me come to you next. For the Nature Conservancy, I mean, you've been in this space for a long time. How are you dealing with these issues in terms of how you put together your projects and addressing some of the issues that Pedro's talked about so far?
Yeah, thank you. So for those who don't know, the Nature Conservancy, we've been working on carbon markets for over 20 years in various different fora and kind of initiatives. So some of it has been trying to come up with methodologies of how do you actually calculate the emissions within a project. Some has been doing projects, some's been doing policy and advocacy. So I wanted to pick up on a couple of points Pedro made, but maybe start with framing, which is TNC is a science-based organization, and science improves over time. And so, I think part of the quality conversation is a natural outcome of you have old methodologies which no longer use best practices, and people are kind of picking up on that and are realizing and calling that out and saying this needs to be better. But I don't think this narrative is always a bad thing. Like, we want it always to be improving. And ideally, 10 years from now, we'll have better new methodologies that are more accurate than what we're using today. So as part of that, I'd say there's kind of two piece parts of what we're doing. One is science. So one is really trying to look at things like baselines and like permanence and things like that, and really trying to figure out how can we make this more accurate and more transparent and better. So one of the things that we've really invested a lot of time in the last probably 2, 3, 4 years is this thing called dynamic baselines. So usually with the forestry project, you would start the project and you would kind of project going forward what the emissions reductions might be. What we're doing with this new dynamic baseline model is we're having real-time control plots that are not part of the project, and basically assessing that in a real, update throughout the entire project's lifespan to see, okay, what is our project doing in comparison with these control projects. And so that's something we got the methodology approved through Vera, I want to say last year, and that's something we're hoping to start to see adopted in different types of forestry methodologies, because we started just in the US. But so the science piece is a huge part of what we're doing of trying to improve quality. The other piece, which I think is equally important, is bringing the whole market together. So we have been participating in the ICVCM. We also will participate with a lot of other NGOs, because if anyone works at an NGO or has interacted with an NGO, we all have very strong opinions on this, and sometimes we think that these very nuanced differences are very important. But really, at the end of the day, we're all looking in general for more quality, right? And we're just confusing the market if we're all arguing with each other. So part of what we've been spending a lot of time the last couple of years on is really trying to work together more and really speak in a more unified voice and support the same types of initiatives. So support things like the ICBCM instead of supporting 20 different initiatives, which is just going to confuse the market. So that's kind of the other big thing that is, I think, just as important as having the science.
Great, thanks. Stella, let me come to you next. You're not in the forestry space. You're in the cooking space. Moving away from biomass into cleaner fuels. Can you talk a little bit about how your projects work and how you protect yourselves on these integrity issues?
Of course. Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me on this panel. So for those of you who don't know, cocoa is the easiest way to explain it. It's a utility company based out of East Africa. We're currently active in Kenya and Rwanda. And what we do is, in order to protect forests, we try and have an energy transition where we try and move people away from charcoal to clean biofuel. And we do this by heavily subsidizing it through carbon credits in order to have people do the green thing, the clean thing, versus the dirty fuel of charcoal. And so we generally see that demand, especially in urban areas where they've depleted the forests around them, and so they're the ones who really are looking for charcoal. And it's where cocoa focuses on most in Kenya. We've reached 1.2 million households in Kenya in 2.5 years of operation, which equates about 6 million people that are using cocoa fuel on the daily. And so we protect forests by moving people away from charcoal. And in terms of the question of integrity and how we ensure that, we have a lot of independent studies and reviews of our cook stoves and their use. But we also, in addition to everything that Pedro mentioned in terms of quality criteria, I would also propose that we look at financial additionality and financial impact. And so at Cocoa, we take that very seriously. We open up our books to all our carbon credit buyers and show them exactly where every cent goes. And so you can see the impact of everything from how does it benefit the local community, who is involved, how do we actually subsidize it. The easiest way to think about subsidy is like the Uber model. So when Uber started, they subsidized each ride, and Cocoa does the same thing where we subsidize each drop of fuel for our end consumers, making it about 40% cheaper than charcoal. And we do that throughout the life cycle of our consumer. And so you see that huge financial impact for them. Most of our consumers, we have about 57% of our consumers buy the smallest amount of fuel quantity per day. So you're looking at people that are earning less than $2 a day. And so, 40% would make a huge impact on their life. And so in terms of integrity, I would also add that financial part where it just creates trust and transparency for the host government, but also for the end buyer.
I'm just curious, how does longevity factor in? Because you have the benefit of having a direct substitution of charcoal-based for something else. You can see the credit, but I don't know how long the stove lasts. Does that get worked into the price of the credit, or how does the longevity issue...
Of the cook stove or of the
of the cook stove itself, yeah.
It's about 10 years.
10 years.
It's completely, you can take it apart, and so it's very easy to what do you call it? Service it.
Service, great.
Yeah.
Great. Jacqueline, let me come to you next, because USAID has been in this space and you're supportive of the projects and you're also involved in the policy. How are you all engaging on this integrity issue, and what's your perspective on how it's going to impact the market?
Thank you, and thanks for having me here today. I'll speak from the perspective of our work across Africa, mostly because that's where I've been engaged. But as USAID, we have supported carbon markets everywhere from Colombia to Indonesia and other countries around the world. From an integrity perspective, we see our biggest value add as kind of our bread and butter, which is supporting governments on technical assistance. And we do so kind of two ways within the carbon markets framework. One is direct assistance to governments. So governments say, we would like to update our legal framework. How do we do it? What do we do? Most recently, in the case of Kenya, with the amendment to the Climate Change Act, we were part of the team that was supporting government of Kenya on that legislation, and now subsequently we're working with government of Kenya on the regulations. But through direct support to governments, what has been clear for us has been we do need to focus on integrity, transparency, and equity. And it's really been supporting the process of stakeholder engagement so that government can hear from a number of stakeholders what integrity means to them and how best to incorporate it into their legislative frameworks. Same thing with equity, is making sure that government understands what equity means from different communities that are going to be impacted directly by carbon markets. And then at a macro level, we work with organizations such as the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative, where we work with a number of stakeholders within the region to really think through what the future of carbon markets might be across the continent. Once again, stressing integrity, transparency, and equity, and also making sure that we do take lessons learned from countries around the continent and apply them as new countries start to gain interest. Whilst we've worked on carbon markets in a place like Kenya for well over a decade, within the past year to two, we've started getting a lot of demand signals from different countries around the continent. And so the big question has been, how do we scale up our own efforts? How do we come up with kind of a basic set of rules and templates that governments should think through? How do we support communication across government agencies so that we are able to put the tax authority with the Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Finance and the like, so they're not talking across each other, but ultimately they come up with the best framework. And so it's really applying the lessons learned from the different countries that we found to be quite helpful. And then in the context of ACMI, it's been helpful to have different players also share their experiences. So to have project developers with indigenous communities also kind of be clear on what makes the most sense for them and how we as a donor can support this type of work across the continent. Now, for us, it's kind of a bittersweet experience. We see this as one important way to mobilize climate finance. But once again, the controversy that has been attached to carbon markets leaves us also sometimes in a very difficult position where we're kind of battling with what the best way is to support countries as they select this, yet still being confused by all of the frameworks and how best we can also support that. So we do engage with all of the verifiers and really also, once again, try to convene everyone so that we at least are clear as we provide assistance, but also really just to provide a platform so we can get to a common agreement on which way forward for VCM.
Great. Really helpful. You raised 2 points I want to follow up on, first on projects and then subsequently on engaging countries. But let me start in projects, and I think Kelly and Stella, this is for you to start with. I mean, there's a lot of concern that sometimes communities are not in an equal power position when it comes to negotiating what the compensation is. That sometimes administrative costs eat up a huge portion of the value, so it doesn't actually trickle down to the communities, and that they're not often, adequately engaged. Now, I heard, Jacqueline was talking about, sort of engaging stakeholders and governments, but I wonder if you can just, maybe with a particular project in mind, give us a concrete example of how do you do this on the ground, in your projects to make sure that the money goes to the right place and that people are, have an equal power position when they're negotiating.
Yeah, it's a huge issue right now. I'm not going to start off with a single project, but just talk about what we're doing around this issue. So generally, this is referred to as benefit sharing, which is that, whoever's participating in the project, the stakeholders, they're getting some sort of benefit from it. At its heart, I think even the way we're talking about that is sometimes wrong. The communities themselves should be the ones who are most empowered to decide what kind of benefits they get and where that goes. Oftentimes what's the case though, because I just did a report on this earlier this year, is in many cases, what you have is you have a project developer come in, they have an idea of what they want to do, they want to make sure that this idea is going to generate credits, so they do all this kind of upfront feasibility work around the science, around what's the credits that we'll get. And only after they've done all of that do they then approach communities to say, oh, here's maybe what you could get, which is too late in the process, right? And then there's usually no pre-feasibility study around, are communities even interested? What do they even want? And so that in of itself is a huge missing piece from the market. And if you look at the standards, most of them don't provide a whole lot of guidance around how to engage with communities. They'll include some things around, you need to have a stakeholder engagement, you need to do free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC for the communities. But there's not a lot on kind of when all this needs to happen, and also that's not a one-time thing. It's a recurring, continuous dialogue, right? And so, frankly, all of this has been missing, and I do think the next big wave of potential articles coming out next year could absolutely be on this issue. And so it's a huge one for carbon markets to start to address. We are seeing some attempts at trying to address this and provide more kind of frameworks and guidance. So for example, the ICVCM includes a bit on kind of how to do better benefit sharing. Some of the standards, like I think Vera had an update a month or two ago that provided a little bit more detail on how to go about it. But for the most part, there's still, I think, a lot of work that could be done. One of the things we're starting to do with all of our projects, not with a specific project, is really try and think through how do we better engage communities as stakeholders and actual owners of the project. Obviously, ownership could vary a lot by country policies and land tenure and all those things, but we're trying to kind of come up with a basic framework of how we can engage them. The other thing we're trying to think through is, I think, this really key issue around how do you have fair financing? And that gets into contracts, and that gets into some things that are really hard to predict, like market dynamics. And so if you have some sort of agreement with communities, you're the project developer, you say, okay, we're going to get 40% of everything that comes from this project. Maybe that made sense when the price was $3 a ton, but you're putting in fixed cost, right? And so anything above that fixed cost is profit. So let's say prices go up to $12 a ton. You're still getting 40%. You're getting a ton of extra profit. And our view as an NGO is more of that should go to the communities. So one of the things we are trying to work on right now is a better kind of fair financing framework to really think through, obviously this has to be unique to each community, and it's going to be driven by the needs and wants of each community, but is there some sort of overall framework we could help develop that would come up with a better kind of approach and better methodology?
Yeah, in the energy world, there's variable royalties which deal with those kind of windfall prices. Maybe there's an answer. So Stella, I want to ask you next about how your projects work, and then Pedro, if you could come in about how this is getting incorporated in the standard or how you're thinking about it in terms of new standards, that would be helpful.
Thank you. So we actually, because you said about profit sharing, Kelly, and we at COCO actually give back the absolute majority of our carbon credits back to the end consumer. And as explained earlier, that is through the subsidy, and we do that through something we call the COCO wallet. So we have these ATM machines, they use the COCO wallets on it. And so basically, throughout the lifetime of the consumer, they will get that direct subsidy into it, and which is quite a significant one. As said, we're 40% cheaper than charcoal, depending on what areas. So it's significant impact for them. We also, in order to ensure that we work with the local governments, so we have an investment agreement in every country that we go into. I don't know if you saw it was in the news a few days or weeks ago about Rwanda, where we ensure that we have government buy-in as well, so that we have that local support. We employ locally, we source locally, and we also, the way we actually get cocoa out there is that we have the largest network of informal corner stores in East Africa. We're about 2,600 corner stores that we work with. 97% of them are women-led. And so I stand corrected on it, but I was reading that there's something like 76,000 people that are somehow directly or indirectly touched by cocoa. And so it's really very much for the community what we're doing and to create that energy transition.
Okay, super.
Yeah. First, let me start by saying what Kelly said back 120% to 100%. Essentially, there are several things around, let's say, considerations around equity and participation in this market that need to be addressed head on. And I am, just like Kelly was saying, I am very concerned that we've done additionality, we've done quantification, as in like that was the last year's topic. The next topic very likely will be issues around why are we doing this? Why is the carbon market providing revenues to make a character of white men like myself going around Latin America and Africa, rather than the communities that are purported to be the beneficiaries. So in terms of what ICVCM, and focusing now just on ICVCM, what we can do, besides obviously putting in, we operate as kind of a meta standard. So what we can do is obviously force the standards themselves, the likes of Vera, etc., to embed into their processes better or more substantial procedures around free, prior, and informed consent, for example. But I think that's not enough. And we have to have a discussion, for example, around, do we need criteria on benefit sharing? For what is adequate benefit sharing, or high quality? What do we expect that a high quality credit should provide in terms of this percentage? Hearing Stella talk about her system, that looks like platinum kind of benefit sharing, but the vast majority of projects are not really like that. And so we need to change that. And I would even go a little bit further, saying, to date the model has been that you have a carbon developer that reaches a community with an idea. I would rather much see that the communities themselves are encouraged to come up with their ideas, with their methodologies to the extent possible. So one of the things that we are doing at the ICVCM, we're setting up together with our sister organization, the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, an IPLC engagement forum. And the idea is exactly that. It's to motivate, to engage indigenous peoples, but to motivate them also in terms of them being agents rather than just passive receivers of benefits, determining what is it exactly that they want to see the market doing for them.
That's been the revolution in the development space, is sort of bottom-up projects rather than just top-down. I want to pick up, Jacqueline, on another point that you made about engaging governments, and I'll give a little plug for my colleagues here at the Atlantic Council. They've done a paper, George Frampton and Ken Berlin and a couple of other colleagues, on whether there might not be a better way to do this whole project. That essentially what they argue is that project-based credits are inherently challenged by these questions of additionality and longevity, but jurisdictional-based things, along the lines of John Kerry's new JTEP proposal, that if you engage countries and you have measurement of the stock, essentially, then you have a baseline to measure from, and it's easier to deal with some of these issues. So it's sort of the jurisdictional approach. You're engaging countries rather than project by project, and maybe that makes it easier to scale these markets. So that's sort of just a theory. Do any of you have a perspective on whether that might be a better way? Pedro, do you want to start?
I can start. How to put it this way? I wouldn't necessarily set up projects against jurisdictions. And in fact, I think we're seeing more and more convergence of, so the concerns are the same. And jurisdictional approaches, and we're at EDF are a strong supporter, for example, of jurisdictional approaches to deforestation, and we support the Energy Transition Accelerator. They do address issues around leakage. They can address issues around additionality. They can address issues around quantification. But likewise, we see what Vera has done, for example, with their project-based level methodology, where they've just introduced a new methodology, which is predicated on a national baseline that is independent from the project developer himself. The project developer takes on, it's a given in the methodology. so we see that convergence of, the project framework, the project level framework, and the jurisdictional level framework, and we see scope also for nesting of existing projects under a jurisdictional baseline. So I wouldn't set off these necessarily, contrast them so much, but certainly there's a huge potential for jurisdictional red. There's also some concerns, and I'll address those concerns, which is, to put it very bluntly, if you get it wrong, you get it wrong at a jurisdictional scale. So you have to be much more rigorous in what you're approaching in terms of, for instance, the baseline construct when you are doing a jurisdictional red program. So there's an endless discussion about, which is better. I wouldn't go into that discussion. I would say, whatever we're doing, we have to increase quality across, whether it's quantification, proper additional provisions, etc.
I think I absolutely agree with Pedro. I think the only additions I'll have is, from a USAID perspective, we are responsive to our government partners. And so it really is for governments to say what they think will work best for them. And then we then provide whatever support for what they want. So we do collaborate closely with our colleagues at the State Department on the ETA, and if that is something that a country wants, once again, we're able to provide support for that versus VCM. Besides kind of making sure that governments have agency within this process, I think a big thing that we recognize is that in a lot of the countries we operate in, there's a capacity gap. And so the way we approach the question is, how do we make sure that you do have the information you need to make the decisions you need to make? And so we do spend a lot of time doing capacity building kind of across different levels of government, because oftentimes when we start the conversation, there are very few people that have any knowledge on carbon, or it's a person sitting within a Ministry of of Environment that no one else across government is listening to. And so it's really making sure that we work across different government institutions to make sure that there are more experts, and also that as they try to experiment and think through what the future might hold, whether it is jurisdictional, whether it is kind of Article 6, that they're fully informed and kind of make the best decisions, for themselves.
Kelly, do you want to come in?
I mean, I would echo what both the other panelists have said. From TNC's perspective, I would say we actively have voluntary carbon projects. We invested in the World Bank's Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, which was the first kind of attempt at doing jurisdictional scale deforestation. And we also have someone who's on the board of Art Trees, which is kind of the next iteration of jurisdictional Red Plus. We're trying to make sure all of them work, right? We're not sure which one is going to work best in which country. As you said, I mean, each country kind of has their own capacity, their own preferences on if they really just want to outsource this and let project developers deal with it, or if they really want to centralize it and have it all go through them. And I don't think there is a single, best way. And I don't think, between projects and jurisdictions, as Pedro was saying, it's not that one is necessarily better than the other. They both have risks. And I think the important piece with both is just to make sure we're continually being honest and transparent and open about lessons learned and what could be improved over time, because this is horrendously complicated stuff. You're trying to stop deforestation, I mean, there's so many different drivers of that, right? So it's not going to be that you just, unwrap some present and you're like, great, here's the solution. It's really complicated. So we need to constantly be trying to iterate and improve and make sure we're always thinking about that in the back of our minds.
Let me ask next about the significant gap in the price per metric ton between voluntary markets and compliance markets. I mean, it's a huge multiple, and I would imagine a big challenge to scaling up these kinds of solutions in the voluntary market. Stella, I can start with you. I think you work in a compliance market, so but do you have any sense of how you bridge this gap, or?
So we're actually active in the voluntary market. We used to be in the compliant market. We started off under the CDM. Our methodology is actually still CDM fuel switch methodology, but is now under gold standard. So we're very active in the voluntary carbon market. We are looking to go back to a compliance market because I think we've all seen it. It's very murky waters, as I call it. There's been so much bad news, and it's difficult to navigate and to get buyers on board because they've simply pulled back. They're afraid. And so I unfortunately don't have the magical answer on how to best address it. But I would say, creating that transparency, as I mentioned earlier, is and really proving to your buyers, but also to governments and communities, the benefit that you're bringing, and from governments to also have very clear frameworks on what they're expecting from projects. Especially now we're talking a lot about corresponding adjustments. Everyone wants them, everyone's looking for them. And so I think it's the government's role to ensure that we have transparency, that we're ensuring that jobs are created from it, that we're giving back to the community, and that they vet the projects properly. And that's more of the compliance market. But yeah, I think we should put the same standards for the voluntary.
Kelly, Jacqueline, before I go to Pedro, because this is going to land on him to fix this problem. But do either of you have any perspectives on how you bridge this gap? Or is it mostly, Pedro, you just need to hurry up and get this job done so that everybody can have more confidence in the voluntary market?
I think pricing is a really difficult question. So I used to work before this at Ecosystem Marketplace, which produces this annual report, and we would be asking project developers basically, how much are you selling for? And to be frank, even though every year we came out with this overall number saying, on average, prices might be $3 a ton, $5 a ton, whatever. In reality, I was seeing some transactions of 20 cents per ton, which frankly, I don't even know how there's any profit margin at all there. And some were more than $70 a ton. So I guess the first piece is with pricing, it's hugely variable. Part of that is really dependent on supply. So a lot of the really small projects would sell for much higher. The really big projects would be able to sell for less and still kind of make that work. Part of it, though, is I think there's this, maybe it's just a gut feeling that we all have that ideally higher quality projects should be worth more. That's not always the case. You could have a really great project that can do things really cheaply and really effectively somewhere. So I do think, even though we want to see prices go up, there are so many other factors around supply, around, what is quality and how do you ensure that in different countries. I mean, it's going to be so dependent on different countries, on different kind of communities, on kind of what you're doing, what types of projects you're doing, that it's never that, easy just to say, oh, this is what the price should be. Compliance markets are easier because usually it says, here's the price if you're paying for an allowance or whatever. So in maybe New Zealand, it's $50 or something. And so if you're an offset seller, you're saying, well, maybe I'll sell for $45, but I'm not going to go much lower, right? So it's easier because you kind of have something to peg it to. And that's just an inherent difference, right, in how the voluntary market works versus compliance.
I think just a short one. The feedback we're getting from a lot of our African counterparts is we need to do more on pricing because the pricing difference between African credits versus European is one that will not be acceptable for kind of much longer for a lot of African countries. And so to ensure the predictability in regulatory systems that everyone wants, and to avoid governments kind of creating knee-jerk reactions when they do see such varied prices. I think this question of price, African compared to different places, and I know, different with soil and different types of projects, but I think a lot of what we're trying to do as we engage with governments is, one, just educate them on the different pricing of different categories of carbon, but two, also, as we have global conversations, really just highlight the price difference, especially since for many African countries, this is kind of the next gold that they are relying on. So how can we do better for them is something that we're being pushed quite far on to figure out with African countries.
Gotcha, thank you. Pedro, I'm going to give you, we're almost at the end of our time, the last words. But I guess there are two things here. One is the broad question of voluntary versus compliance markets. Is it really just a question of creating more confidence in the voluntary markets? But if you could also pick up on Jacqueline's point of sort of this interregional equity issue too, which is how do you value a forest in Africa versus one in Latin America versus one in Europe? Is that a standards issue, or is that a market issue?
That last one is a difficult one. Let me first address one thing, which I think is it really is almost an educational point that needs to be made. When I hear people comparing or contrasting a price in the voluntary carbon market with the price of an allowance under the European Union emissions trading system, they're talking about two markets that do not intersect. They might as well be talking about the price of oil, right? They do not intersect. The price of an allowance under the European Union emissions trading system is motivated by weather patterns in Europe, the availability of hydro and renewables and wind and solar, and whether or not you're getting natural gas and other things like geopolitical factors. Do we have access to Russian gas? None of it has to do with carbon or climate in a broader sphere. It's motivated by all of these factors, plus the caps that we have on European industry. So it's, I think, a little bit difficult to start a conversation when the other part, and I've seen that, and I've seen people repeatedly say, why are we not getting 80 euros a ton? Like, you're not getting 80 euros a ton because, first of all, nobody would pay 80 euros a ton if they could. They would pay 60 or 50 or 40 or 30 or 20, but they have to because they're in this closed-off system. Right? So these are two different markets, and I think that's a really important point. Then the same thing that Kelly said, quality and price should be correlated, but only to a certain extent. The idea that infinitely higher priced carbon is better quality doesn't resonate, and we've seen that in the past. We've had higher prices, and guess what? We now know that those higher prices didn't correspond to quality. So what I'm more interested when we talk about this pricing issue is it really about transparency. And what I think is missing in this market is the fact that, make a comparison to the oil market, a commodity market. You have daily transactions of oil. They are benchmarked against a reference price, just a WTI or Brent. That doesn't mean that your specific delivery is reflected in the benchmark, but you know what the benchmark is. So, to take this to carbon, when a community or a carbon project developer approaches a community with a certain price, there ought to be a way for that community, for example, to understand what it is that the right reference price is for that type of project, how much will it sell for in the European or the American voluntary market. And that would be the starting point for a conversation. Right now, we don't have that information. We don't have any specific benchmark. No, what we do have is standardized products that sell at a huge discount in places like Singapore. So you can have a contract under the Singapore Carbon Exchange, but you're not contracting the types of projects that we're all talking about here. You're not contracting COCOS projects. You're contracting, HFC 23 projects from years old. So that is, I think, really the missing piece right now in terms of that price transparency that we could aim to have in the near future.
Really helpful. I think we're pretty close to the end of our time here, so I want to say thanks to all of you here in the audience, COP28, for joining us today. Thanks to the Atlantic Council team for putting on the production. And finally, if we can have a hand for our panelists for such a great and frank discussion.